What if the greatest battle of your life had already been decided? Not metaphorically, not strategically, but literally decided, with casualties counted. With cities burned. With your name written in the archives of a future that hasn't happened yet, and what if you only discovered that truth because you were winning? Cale Arden didn't believe in destiny. He believed in patterns. In probabilities. In the quiet mathematics hidden beneath chaos. At 23. He had already become the youngest lead strategist in the United Human Fleet. While admirals twice his age relied on brute force and overwhelming firepower, Cale relied on anticipation. He saw the invisible structure beneath enemy movement. He predicted decisions before they were consciously made. He didn't guess. He calculated. That was why humanity trusted him. That was why the air feared him, and that was why something felt wrong. The war began without declaration. One moment, deep space monitoring stations were transmitting routine data from the edge of the solar system. The next, they went silent. Not destroyed in spectacular explosions, just erased. Signals cut mid-sentence, then the shapes appeared, organic war forms sliding out of distorted space like living shadows. No metallic edges. No visible propulsion. Their ships curved and pulsed as if breathing. They didn't send messages, they didn't issue demands, they simply advanced. Humanity reacted the only way it knew how, with force. Cale's first command assignment came during what historians would later call the Outer Ring Clash. A defensive line near Saturn's orbit had collapsed. Panic spread across the fleet. The air moved with unnatural coordination, as if every ship knew exactly where human reinforcements would appear. Cale studied the battlefield for less than 4 minutes, then he made a decision that no simulation had suggested. He ordered a gravitational slingshot maneuver using Saturn's pull, not to retreat, but to disappear from sensors and re-emerge behind the air formation. It was reckless. If the timing failed by even a fraction, his entire strike division would be torn apart. It didn't fail. His fleet tore through the air command cluster with surgical precision. Energy cores ruptured. Organic hulls split open in silent flashes of white plasma. Within 18 minutes, the enemy formation disintegrated. It was a flawless victory, the kind that builds legends. Celebrations echoed across communication channels. Analysts called it genius. Admirals called it historic, but Cale didn't celebrate, because during the final moments of the battle, just before the last air vessel collapsed, something strange happened. His tactical display flickered, not a malfunction. An overlap, for less than a second. He saw a different projection layered over the battlefield, one that showed his maneuver before he had executed it. His ships moving exactly as they had moved. The air adjusting positions in response. Before he had issued the order, the image vanished instantly. No one else on the bridge reacted. Glitch? His communications officer asked casually. Cale said nothing. After the battle, salvage teams recovered fragments from destroyed air vessels. Among them were crystalline structures emitting low, rhythmic pulses. Scientists believed they were data storage units. When decrypted, the first fragment froze the entire research division. It contained a combat simulation of the Outer Ring Clash, every human maneuver, every energy discharge, every casualty. Time-stamped 73 hours before the battle occurred. The official explanation was espionage, predictive modeling, advanced probability mapping. Cale wanted to believe that. He tried, but something didn't align. Predictive systems account for patterns, they don't account for improvisation, and his Saturn maneuver had been improvised, spontaneous, unshared, yet there it was. Recorded. Anticipated. As if the air hadn't predicted it, but remembered it. The next battle only deepened the fracture in his certainty. Near Titan, communications interference forced Cale to alter strategy mid-combat. He abandoned the initial assault pattern and split his forces into 3 irregular vectors, an unpredictable move designed to create chaos in the enemy response. Again. It worked. Again, the Air Command Corps collapsed, but this time. As debris drifted across the battlefield, a transmission pierced through static, short, distorted, but unmistakable, confirmed. He chose again. Again, the word echoed inside Cale long after the battle ended. Not he chose this. Not he changed. Again. As if this was repetition. As if the war was not unfolding, but replaying. Sleep became rare after that. Cale began reviewing archived battle footage obsessively. Frame by frame. Micro movements of air vessels. Reaction times. Formation shifts. They weren't reacting defensively, they were correcting deviations, like someone adjusting a trajectory to maintain a known destination. That realization crawled under his skin. If the enemy already knew the outcome, then what was he fighting? Victory or confirmation? The turning point came during a deep space engagement beyond Neptune's orbit. An unstable gravitational disturbance tore through the battlefield, disrupting navigation systems. For 7 seconds, Cale's flagship was caught inside the anomaly. 7 seconds, long enough, the bridge fell silent as space bent around them. Light stretched. Sound collapsed into a distant hum, and Cale saw something no strategist should ever see: the war over, Earth scarred but standing, entire colonies gone. A treaty projection floating above a ruined planetary surface, and within the historical archive display a name: the man responsible for initiating the final offensive that escalated the conflict beyond recovery. Cale Arden. He blinked. The anomaly released them. The battlefield snapped back into place. His crew resumed movement, unaware that anything had happened beyond mild turbulence. But Cale didn't move, because he understood something. In that frozen moment that shattered everything he believed about cause and effect, the war wasn't heading toward an outcome. It had already reached one. Somewhere ahead, and every victory he secured, every brilliant maneuver, wasn't bringing humanity closer to survival. It was guiding them toward a future already written, and somehow, he was the one who had written it. That was the day Cale Arden realized something no commander is ever trained to face. He wasn't fighting to win, he was fighting inside a result, and if that result already existed, then the real question wasn't how to defeat the enemy. It was whether he had the courage to stop himself. The Air were not superior in firepower, they were superior in perception. Human intelligence divisions spent months trying to understand their advantage. Their ships were organic, adaptive, and biomechanical, but that wasn't what made them unstoppable. It was how they experienced time. For humans, time moves forward. Cause comes first. Effect comes after. Decisions shape the future. For the Air, time was not aligned. It was a structure. They didn't wait for outcomes, they accessed them. The Air, past, present, and future were not moments separated by distance. They were coordinates, directions, angles of observation. Imagine standing in front of a mountain. A human sees only the side they're facing, the Air see the mountain from every side at once. That was the difference. When human fleets launched an attack, the Air didn't scramble in surprise. They shifted with calm precision, like someone correcting a memory rather than responding to a threat. They weren't predicting, they were navigating, and that explained the pattern. Cale kept noticing: no hesitation. No confusion. No overreaction, even when human strategies changed unexpectedly. The Air adjusted within seconds, as if those unexpected moves were already part of something familiar. This wasn't luck. It wasn't advanced AI. It was temporal awareness, captured Air fragments confirmed it. Their crystalline structures emitted energy signatures that didn't follow linear decay. Signals pulsed backward through time as easily as forward. Human physicists struggled to categorize it. Cale didn't struggle. He understood the implication immediately. If the air could perceive multiple outcomes, then every battle wasn't a confrontation. It was a selection. They weren't asking, what will happen? They were asking, which version are we currently inside? That meant something terrifying. Every time Cale changed a tactic, every time he believed he was outsmarting them, he might only be stepping into another branch they had already seen, and if they had seen the end, if they knew how the war concluded, then their objective might not be victory at all. It might be preservation of a specific outcome. That was the moment Cale realized. The truth wasn't that the air were unbeatable. It was worse, they were fighting from a position where the ending already existed, and if the ending already existed, then someone, somewhere in the timeline, had created it, and Cale was beginning to suspect that someone was him. Cale's maneuver near Titan should have been impossible to predict. Communications were jammed. Sensors were distorted. Half the fleet was out of formation. The original battle plan collapsed within minutes. So Cale did what he always did. He improvised. He split his forces into 3 irregular attack vectors, no symmetry, no pattern, no repetition from previous engagements. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't textbook. It was chaotic, and chaos was something the air had never handled well. Or at least that's what everyone believed. The strike worked perfectly. Human destroyers pierced the air flank. A concentrated plasma barrage destabilized their central war form. Within minutes, their formation began to dissolve. Another victory, another proof that Cale was humanity's greatest strategic weapon. But when the final air vessel collapsed, something unexpected happened. Instead of retreating in disarray, the remaining fragments shifted into a brief, synchronized alignment, not defensive, not offensive, intentional. A transmission broke through the interference field, short, distorted, almost calm, confirmed. He chose again. Silence followed. No counterattack. No final strike, just withdrawal. The bridge crew exchanged confused looks. Analysts assumed it was corrupted signal data, but Cale didn't dismiss it, because of one word. Again, that word didn't belong in the present tense. It implied repetition, not adjustment, not surprise, repetition. After the battle, recovery teams collected debris from the destroyed air vessels. Among the organic wreckage, they found crystalline memory cores, intact, when decrypted. One file froze the entire intelligence division. It was a combat record of the Titan engagement, every human movement, every fleet division split, every micro-adjustment Cale had made in real time. Timestamp? 41 hours before the battle, not estimated, not simulated, recorded. And the most disturbing part? The file didn't label the maneuver as an anomaly. It labeled it as a confirmed iteration. Iteration.as. If the battle wasn't happening for the first time. As. If it had already unfolded, more than once, when the report reached Cale. He read it alone. No emotional reaction. No visible shock, but something shifted internally. Until that moment, he had believed the air were extraordinary tacticians. Now, a new possibility emerged. They weren't responding to his decisions, they were verifying them, like observers checking weather. Events were aligning with something already known, and if this battle had been an iteration, how many others had been? How many of his victories were truly victories? For the first time in his life, Cale experienced something unfamiliar on a battlefield, not fear, not doubt, but displacement. As. If he were walking through events that had already happened somewhere else, and if the enemy had heard him choose again. Then the question wasn't whether the heir knew the future. The real question was far worse. How many times had he already made these same choices? The anomaly near Neptune wasn't supposed to matter. It was a minor gravitational distortion, unstable, but not catastrophic. Fleet Command ordered minor course corrections. Nothing unusual until Kale's flagship drifted half a degree too close. For 7 seconds, reality bent, the stars stretched into thin lines. Sound collapsed into a low vibration. Every screen on the bridge flickered, then went white. No alarms, no explosions, just suspension, and in that suspension, Kale saw it, not a vision, not imagination, data, structured. Historical. Final, the war was over, Earth still existed, but scarred. Orbital rings shattered. Entire colonies listed as lost beyond recovery. Casualty numbers scrolling in cold. Emotionless precision, then came the archive marker. The final offensive against the heir homeworld, authorization. Supreme Strategic Command, lead architect. Kale Arden, his name, not as a defender, not as a hero. As the initiator, the record unfolded faster than he could process. A decisive strike. A preemptive assault justified as necessary for human survival. An attack so overwhelming that it ensured no air retaliation would ever be possible again, because there would be no air left to retaliate. Genocide, framed as strategy, the war that humanity claimed had started with alien aggression, was, in its final form, concluded by human annihilation, and he had designed it. The anomaly released the ship, the stars snapped back into place, bridge systems rebooted, minor distortion, a navigation officer reported calmly. All systems operational. No one else reacted. No one else had seen. Kale remained standing. Eyes fixed forward, breathing steady, but internally. Everything had fractured. It wasn't the destruction that haunted him most, it was the timing. The archive didn't describe the end as a branching possibility. It described it as completed history, which meant one thing. Somewhere in the structure of time, that future already existed, and if it already existed, then every decision he was making now was not leading toward it. It was maintaining it. The heir's behavior suddenly made sense, their precision, their calm corrections, their lack of panic. They weren't fighting to win, they were fighting to prevent that final offensive. They had seen it, they were living in the shadow of their extinction, and if they were acting to preserve their survival, then from their perspective, humanity wasn't defending itself, humanity was becoming the threat. Kale felt the weight of something far heavier than command responsibility. He wasn't just a strategist inside a war. He was the origin point of its escalation. Every victory he secured strengthened his reputation. Every reputation milestone increased his authority. Every increase in authority moved him closer to the moment when he would have the power to authorize the final strike. The anomaly hadn't shown him a random future. It had shown him the logical conclusion of his success, and that was the most terrifying realization of all. He didn't become a monster because he failed. He became one because he won, for the first time. Kale questioned something he had never questioned before. What if the path to saving humanity was the same path that guaranteed the war would truly begin? After the anomaly near Neptune, Kale stopped looking at battles the same way. He stopped asking, how do we win? He started asking, what does this victory create? Using recovered air crystalline cores, human scientists reconstructed fragments of temporal mapping, partial structures of how the heir perceived events. Most of it was incomprehensible, but Kale wasn't searching for full understanding. He was searching for confirmation, and he found it, buried inside layered probability. Threads was a convergence point, a strategic escalation event repeatedly marked as critical. the data translated into something chillingly simple. Human offensive, non-reversible, the timestamp aligned with the archive he had seen in the anomaly, the final offensive, the strike against the air homeworld, and the authorization signature tied to it? Him.at first, he tried to rationalize it. Maybe the future was a misinterpretation, maybe the air had manipulated the anomaly, maybe it was psychological warfare, but the more he analyzed, the clearer the structure became. And the projected timeline. Humanity continued winning, each victory strengthened political pressure to eliminate the air permanently. Public fear turned into anger. Anger turned into policy, end the threat. Ensure permanent safety. Strike before they evolve further. Kale, the undefeated strategist, became the symbol of certainty, and certainty is dangerous, because when people believe you are always right, they stop questioning you. In that future, he didn't launch the final offensive out of hatred. He launched it out of logic. A cold calculation. If the air could perceive time non-linearly, then allowing them to exist meant permanent strategic instability. The only way to secure humanity's future was to erase the variable. From his perspective, it was necessary. From theirs, it was extinction, and that changed everything, because it meant the current war, the one unfolding now, wasn't initiated by random alien aggression. It was a preemptive containment effort. The air had seen their annihilation, they had traced it back to its source, Kale. Arden, not the young commander, not yet, but the future version of him who would decide their fate. They weren't trying to conquer Earth, they were trying to prevent their own genocide, which meant history had inverted. Humanity believed it was defending itself, the air believed they were defending themselves. Both sides thought they were preventing catastrophe. Both sides were technically correct, and at the center of the paradox stood one unavoidable truth. Kale wasn't the savior of humanity. He was the trigger. Every tactical success he achieved increased the probability of political consolidation. Every consolidation increased the chance of total war. Authorization, every step forward tightened the loop. The war didn't begin with a single attack. It began with momentum, and he was generating it. That was the emotional fracture. Kale had built his identity around protection, around saving lives through superior strategy. Now he understood the unbearable inversion. By protecting humanity too effectively, he was ensuring a future where billions would die, not by accident. By his command, for the first time in his career, victory felt indistinguishable from failure, because if the air were fighting to stop the future he had seen, then in their eyes, he wasn't a hero rising through the ranks. He was a countdown. From that point on, every battle felt different, not because the explosions were louder, not because the stakes were higher, but because Kale finally understood what victory meant. Victory meant momentum, momentum meant influence, influence meant authority, and authority meant that one day the decision would be his, the final strike, the irreversible order, the moment the war would truly begin. Until now, winning had always been simple. You outthink the enemy. You outmaneuver them. You minimize your losses and maximize theirs, but what if winning is the very thing that guarantees catastrophe? That was the paradox tightening around him. If he continued defeating the air, humanity would grow confident, aggressive. Political leaders would demand permanent security. The public, tired of fear, would crave closure, and closure in war rarely means peace. It means elimination. But if Kale deliberately weakened his strategies, if he allowed defeats, millions could die now, colonies could fall, entire fleets could be lost. He would be sacrificing the present to alter a future only he had seen. Who would believe him? Who would follow a commander who suddenly chose caution over dominance? From a moral standpoint, The equation was unbearable: save lives today. Ensure genocide tomorrow, risk lives today. Possibly prevent extinction altogether. There was no clean solution, only trade-offs measured in blood across time. The cruelest part? He didn't become dangerous because he was reckless. He became dangerous because he was effective. His brilliance was the catalyst, his precision was the acceleration mechanism. The more indispensable he became, the closer he moved to the moment when no one would question his judgment, and that future version of him, the one he saw in the anomaly, hadn't looked evil. He had looked convinced. That was what terrified Cale most, not that he might become a monster, but that he might become rational, that he would sit in a command chamber decades from now, review all accumulated data, weigh survival probabilities, and conclude that annihilating the heir was simply the logical endpoint. He knew himself. He knew how his mind worked. If the math supported it strongly enough, he would do it. That realization shattered any illusion that this was about destiny. It wasn't fate forcing his hand. It was consistency, given the same pressures, the same victories, the same escalation curve. He would make the same decision again. That word echoed back into his thoughts, confirmed. He chose again. Maybe the heir weren't mocking him, maybe they were tracking inevitability. Cale stood alone in the observation deck of his flagship, staring at the distant stars, for the first time in his life. He didn't want to calculate the optimal move. He wanted uncertainty. He wanted imperfection, because perfection was guiding him straight toward the version of himself that would end a civilization. The paradox was complete. To save humanity, he had to stop being its greatest weapon. To prevent genocide, he had to prevent his own rise, and the question that now defined everything was brutally simple: was he strong enough to lose? Cale didn't search for hope. He searched for deviation, inside the recovered air temporal matrices. There were thousands of branching projections, most collapsing back into the same convergence point. The final offensive, human authorization, irreversible extinction, but buried beneath dominant probability lines. There was something weaker, unstable, almost erased. A thin branch that never reached escalation. He isolated it. At first glance, it looked worse. Human fleets suffered heavier losses in early engagements. Several outer colonies fell. Political unrest intensified. Confidence in Central Command fractured, and one detail stood out immediately: there was no record of Cale Arden rising to supreme strategic authority. His career plateaued early, then vanished. In that branch, his name disappeared from military archives within a few years of the war's outbreak. No promotion. Trajectory. No growing influence. No consolidation of command under his leadership, without his string of decisive victories. Humanity didn't gain overwhelming momentum, which meant something critical. They never developed the certainty required to justify total annihilation. The war dragged longer, messier, more uncertain, and uncertainty changed behavior. Instead of preparing a final strike, humanity shifted toward containment and negotiation. Fear remained, but without decisive dominance. There was no political mandate for extermination. Eventually, indirect communication attempts with the heir succeeded, not because either side trusted the other, but because neither side could guarantee survival through total war. In this branch, peace wasn't heroic. It wasn't triumphant. It was reluctant, fragile, imperfect, but the heir homeworld remained intact. Humanity survived. The cycle never locked into inevitability, and the reason was brutally clear: without Cale's brilliance, accelerating escalation, the timeline never reached critical mass. He wasn't just a participant in the war. He was the catalyst that transformed conflict into Extinction, his existence created efficiency, his efficiency created dominance, dominance created fear in the air, fear created preemptive resistance, resistance validated human aggression, and the loop closed, remove him, the loop weakens, not cleanly, not painlessly, but enough to avoid the irreversible moment. Kale stared at the projection of that fragile branch for a long time. In it, humanity struggled. In it, people died who might otherwise have lived under his protection, but billions who would have died in the final offensive survived. Then he located the final confirmation, population registry cross-reference, genetic continuity tracking. In that branch, he was never born, not killed, not erased midlife, never conceived, minor shifts in historical events altered the chain that would have led to his existence. A delayed deployment. Here. A different posting for his parents there, tiny variables, massive consequence, the timeline stabilized without him, and in doing so, it stabilized the war, for the first time since the anomaly. Kale felt something close to clarity. The solution wasn't about changing a battle. It wasn't about sabotaging a strategy. It wasn't about convincing command. It was about removing the anchor point. Him. The war escalated because he existed within it. Without him, history became less efficient, less optimized, less certain, and certainty was the real enemy. He finally understood the scale of the decision forming in front of him. To prevent genocide, he wouldn't need to lose a battle. He would need to lose himself, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally, because in every dominant timeline where he survived and rose to power, the heir died, but in the one timeline where peace endured, he never took his first breath, and that meant the most terrifying conclusion of all: the future didn't require him to become a villain. It required him to never exist at all. The War Council chamber was silent when Kale entered. Projected star maps floated above a circular table of light. Red markers pulsed across air-controlled sectors. Blue formations advanced steadily inward. Momentum was undeniable. We have them contained, one admiral stated. Another coordinated strike and their outer defense network collapses. Another added, public approval is at its highest point since the war began. The people want resolution. Resolution. Kale knew what that word would eventually mean. He studied the projections in front of him. Every line of probability pointed toward overwhelming human advantage within 2 years. 2 years, that was all it would take for his authority to become absolute. Commander Arden, the fleet director, said calmly, if we maintain this pace, we can force total surrender. Kale didn't correct him, because he had already seen what total surrender evolved into, not surrender, erasure. He ran the numbers silently. If he continued leading flawlessly, escalation was mathematically inevitable. Political pressure would merge with strategic opportunity. Fear would be reframed as necessity, and when that moment came, he knew exactly what he would say: it's the only way to guarantee our survival. The words echoed from the future version of himself, calm, logical, unquestioned. That was the danger, not rage, not revenge, certainty. The council waited for his assessment. Kale spoke carefully. We request 24 hours before authorizing the next phase. Murmurs rippled across the chamber. 24 hours? An admiral repeated. For what? For confirmation, Kale replied that it wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth. He wasn't confirming the enemy's weakness, he was confirming his own decision. That night, alone aboard his flagship, Kale reviewed the fragile timeline again, the one where he never existed. He examined the early defeats, the losses, the instability. He forced himself to confront the cost. If he acted, people would die who might otherwise survive. If he didn't act, entire civilizations would vanish decades from now. There was no clean morality here, only scale, only time. He opened a secure channel and began recording a classified message, not for the council, not for history, for whoever might uncover fragments of the truth someday. He explained the loop, the convergence point, the inevitability tied to his rise. He didn't frame himself as a hero. He framed himself as a variable. If you are hearing this, he said evenly, then the timeline has already shifted. And if it has shifted, then this decision was necessary. He paused only once, not from doubt, from awareness. This wasn't a tactical sacrifice. This wasn't martyrdom on a battlefield. This was self-erasure, not death in combat, removal from causality. He studied navigational charts of nearby spatial instabilities, regions where gravitational distortion interacted unpredictably with temporal fields. There was one unstable, unmapped, irrecoverable a location where a ship could vanish beyond traceable coordinates. A place no fleet would pursue. If he altered his jump vector during the upcoming offensive mobilization, his flagship could slip into that distortion before anyone detected deviation. From an external perspective, it would look like a navigation failure. A tragic accident, the fleet would lose its lead strategist, momentum would fracture, escalation would slow, political certainty would weaken, the timeline would destabilize just enough. Kale closed the projection. For the first time in his life, he wasn't planning a victory, he was planning an absence. An absence, he realized, was the only move the heir would never be able to anticipate, because in every dominant timeline they had mapped, he survived. He rose. He chose. This would be the first time he didn't. The fleet assembled in perfect formation, hundreds of human warships aligned at the edge of air-controlled space, engines humming in synchronized readiness. Energy signatures pulsed like a single heartbeat. This was it, the offensive that would break the stalemate, the operation that would cement Kale Arden as the architect of humanity's final victory. From the outside, everything was proceeding exactly as expected, which was precisely the problem. On the command deck of his flagship, Kale stood composed, calm, precise, unreadable, jump coordinates locked, navigation reported, the primary vector aimed directly toward the air defensive corridor. A decisive strike route. Kale reviewed it one last time, then silently, he input a secondary override, buried beneath standard authorization layers only he could access. A fractional deviation, small enough to avoid immediate detection, large enough to redirect his ship toward the spatial instability he had identified. On your command, Commander. He looked at the fleet display, hundreds of lives under his responsibility, billions depending on the outcome. He opened a secure transmission channel across all human vessels. His voice was steady. Execute jump sequence. Light fractured across space as the fleet entered faster than light. Transition, 4-3 seconds. Every ship followed the same trajectory, then Kale's flagship drifted, subtle at first. A divergence measured in microdegrees. By the time the fleet systems detected the anomaly, it was too late. Commander, our vector is misaligned. I'm aware, Kale replied. He transmitted one final fleet-wide order: abort offensive formation. Fall back to defensive perimeter. Initiate diplomatic relay protocol. Silence answered him, confusion rippled across command channels, but discipline held. Human ships began disengaging from attack formation. Behind them, Long-range sensors registered something unprecedented. The air fleet did not advance, they did not exploit the confusion, they did not fire, they held position. As if observing a deviation they had never recorded. Before Kale's flagship accelerated toward the instability, space ahead shimmered unnaturally. Light bending in impossible angles. Gravitational fields overlapping like torn fabric. No ship that entered had ever returned. Navigation alarms intensified, temporal fluctuations increasing, structural integrity at risk. Kale remained seated for the first time since the war began. He felt no strategic pressure. No calculation. No branching outcomes, only certainty of a different kind. He wasn't winning. He wasn't losing. He was removing the variable. The anomaly expanded across the viewport. Swallowing starlight, for a brief moment, just before the ship crossed the threshold, Kale allowed himself one final thought: if the timeline stabilizes. This will never have happened. Then the flagship entered the distortion. There was no explosion. No debris field. No radiation spike. To external sensors. The ship simply ceased. One moment it existed, the next, it didn't. Across the battlefield, human command channels erupted in disbelief. Search patterns were deployed. Scans returned nothing. No wreckage. No energy residue. No escape pods, just absence. And across the void, the air fleet shifted slightly, subtle repositioning, not aggression, not retreat, recognition. Something fundamental had changed. A convergence point had vanished, for the first time since the war began. Both sides hesitated, and in that hesitation, the cycle fractured. At first, nothing made sense. Human command scrambled to reinterpret the battlefield. The disappearance of Kale's flagship was classified as catastrophic loss. Emergency leadership protocols activated. Secondary commanders assumed temporary authority, but something unexpected followed. The air did not attack, they didn't exploit the confusion, they didn't advance, they didn't retaliate, they simply held position. Days passed, then weeks, without Kale's strategic precision driving aggressive momentum. The human fleet shifted posture. Defensive containment replaced expansion. Political unity fractured without its undefeated symbol. Public opinion changed tone, from confidence to caution, from end this to stabilize this. The planned offensive was never reauthorized, too risky, too uncertain without Kale. Meanwhile, long-range air activity showed a measurable decrease in hostile maneuvering. Interception attempts slowed. Engagement frequency dropped. It wasn't peace, but it wasn't escalation either. The war stopped accelerating, and acceleration had always been the real threat. Over the next 2 years, indirect communication attempts resumed. Not bold diplomatic gestures, small exchanges. Data pulses. Non-aggression corridors. Boundary recognition. The first formal ceasefire wasn't celebrated. It was exhausted into existence. Historians would later describe it as a strategic stalemate resolution. They would debate the turning point endlessly. Some would argue it was resource depletion, others would claim internal air political shifts. A few would point to the unexplained loss of Commander Kale Arden as the momentum broke, but none of them would fully understand, because in the stabilized timeline, Kale Arden had never existed. Records that once listed him as a decorated strategist no longer aligned with verified archives. Personnel databases showed no birth certificate, no academy enrollment, no command assignments. Minor historical discrepancies were corrected quietly by automated systems as causality restructured itself. A delayed transfer here. A reassigned officer Their tiny shifts rippled backward. Chaos. Parents never met under the same circumstances. The chain of events that would have created him dissolved before it formed. He wasn't erased dramatically. He was edited out cleanly, and with him, the inevitability of total war. Decades later, humanity and the air coexisted under a fragile but functional interspecies accord. There were tensions, disputes, border incidents, but no genocide. No final offensive. No extinction event recorded in any archive. The war that had once converged toward annihilation became a footnote of near disaster. A conflict that almost became irreversible, and somewhere outside linear time, beyond structured causality, there was a final echo of awareness, not a body, not a voice, just a fading imprint of consciousness that understood what had changed. Kale never received recognition, never received gratitude, never lived the life he protected, but the loop was broken. The air never needed to preempt extinction, humanity never needed to justify annihilation. The countdown ended before it reached zero. The greatest strategist in human history didn't win by defeating the enemy. He won by removing himself from the equation, and in doing so, he achieved something far more difficult than victory. He made a future where he was unnecessary. The war that had already happened never began.